I call Kevin Hague.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some months ago, the New Zealand public was treated to the image of a rolling mall of initiatives from the government that were tackling the financial crisis that was facing New Zealand and indeed the world. And it seems to me, sir, that it's been some months since we heard that analogy used. And I guess perhaps that's because it was an analogy that called to mind the suggestion that there was some kind of plan of attack. And I think events have shown that that seems to be not the case, that actually on the government benches we're faced with a team that's out of ideas. And certainly in my speech notes I've got All Blacks World Cup 2003, because that indeed seems to be the situation that we're facing. I think, sir, that perhaps a more apt analogy would be the idea of speed to the breakdown, because if we think about that, it requires a team to show an overall understanding of the game situation, requires capabilities of strength, speed, and vision to see the opportunity to score from the breakdown. Yet government's response to the crises that are besetting New Zealand suggest instead the lumbering loose forwards of yesteryear, not understanding the dimensions of the problem, lacking the strength to be able to respond to the problems with sufficient vigour, hopelessly off the pace, and lacking the vision to see this as an opportunity to make the big changes required and to transform our economy. So it is possible to think about money and debt in the same picture. That actually most of the money supply is created by banks, and at the same time that they create money, they create debt. So money and debt get transferred to a person. But of course, that creates an even balance sheet. It's double entry bookkeeping. So in order for people to become wealthy from this situation, money and debt need to become delinked. And so the speculative economy can be viewed as a mechanism for this delinking. The money is siphoned away from ordinary New Zealanders and productive New Zealand businesses into the hands of a wealthy few, while the debt goes nowhere, stays with those ordinary New Zealanders and decent businesses. And some of the individual investment schemes that we've seen over the past several years in New Zealand can be viewed as channels for exactly this mechanism. The process that we've witnessed in New Zealand and indeed in other countries, and we think of Madoff and his Ponzi scheme, has involved a fundamental betrayal of trust. But from the point of view of the luminaries who ran some of these many finance companies and investment schemes, I guess they would say you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. Or perhaps they might more honestly say you can't rort people out of their life savings without losing a bit of trust. So in the first reading debate on this bill, I highlighted three issues. I said that the aims of the bill were indeed laudable, to secure easier access to capital for good businesses. But in order to rebuild trust and confidence and thus enable good businesses to gain access to capital, we needed greater transparency and greater disclosure, not less, as this bill proposes. The second point that I raised in that first reading debate referred to those provisions for special habitual investors, where even less disclosure is proposed. And what I said, sir, was that the history of the past several years showed that these special habitual investors in fact showed exactly the same mix of gullibility and greed as did anyone else. And indeed, sir, poor decisions on the part of precisely this group of people have profound negative consequences for our economy and for all of us. And the third main point that I made, sir, in that first reading debate was that it was woefully inadequate for government to rely on research and consultation undertaken by the Ministry for Economic Development in 2006, as this bill does. And Sir, in my notes today, I have one word written next to this point, and that word is Iceland. 2006, Sir, just to remind the House, Iceland was considered by the IMF to be one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So, since that first reading debate, some greater detail has emerged around some of the practices of these finance companies that have failed. I'm going to mention just a couple of these. First of all, there's the widespread rolling of defaulting loans into new loans. It's a win-win situation for lenders who want their books to look good for potential investors, and for those borrowers who are defaulting. But it's a lose for the public and for potential investors, because the effect of that practice is in fact to obscure the financial health of those companies and institutions. And so sunlight is the best disinfectant. I referred in that first reading speech to the example of Enron, Sir, and those of us who followed the debacle of Enron will have had a sense of déjà vu to read in the newspapers about the practice pursued by some of New Zealand's finance companies of taking the defaulting loans on their balance sheet, selling them to another company days before balance date, and repurchasing them several days later. That's precisely the kind of shenanigans indulged in by Enron. And so there are many other shonky practices engaged in by these companies. My point, Sir, is that these companies were not only light or hazy on disclosure of the financial health of their companies and the risks being taken by investors. Instead, Sir, these companies actively set out to deceive potential investors and to deceive the New Zealand public. Sir, I'm aware that there is still some miles to go on investigating what has occurred in that New Zealand financial sector, and I look forward to that further disclosure of that history with some trepidation. I indicated in the first reading speech to the Green Party's commitment to hearing from those New Zealanders who have been victims of this extraordinary scandal. Those victims, of course, do not typically number amongst them those who actually stood behind those finance companies, who owned them, who reaped the profits from them in the first place. And so I want to offer in this House today the Green Party's support for John Boscawen's call for an inquiry, a proper inquiry into the collapse of these companies. So the Select Committee's report calls effectively for a form of written consent from some of these special investors into the fact that they will receive a lower level of disclosure. The obvious parallel is with the healthcare setting, of course a situation that I know well. Even in healthcare, Sir, we know that informed consent does not always occur. And that, Sir, is a situation where typically the healthcare provider or healthcare professional does not have an enormous incentive to secure the consent of their patient. Healthcare professions also have a long history of professional standards and indeed of ethics, and that, Sir, seems to be a history and a culture sadly lacking from the financial sector. So we've spoken in the House many times now of a Green New Deal, and while we've mainly concentrated on the need to tackle the financial crisis simultaneously with environmental crisis, there were other aspects of the original New Deal that also apply. The New Deal, Sir, re-established, redefined the social contract between state and citizens. One of its tenets was reform of banking and financial sector, That, sir, is an aspect that we require of the new Green New Deal. And sir, the Green Party in this case will continue to oppose this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr.